Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show, where we share the latest sales performance insights through in-depth discussion with experts. Season 3 of our show is your backstage pass to discovering how today's most successful sales and revenue ops teams support go-to-market strategy and improve sales performance. Plus, we'll explore what we can learn about incentives from different industries more broadly. Subscribe to hear how leaders are unlocking new growth, implementing the latest compensation trends, and their priorities for improving go-to-market performance. I'm your host, CEO of Form AI, Nabil Alzam. Nathan, it's great to have you on the show. Thank you for joining today.
Great to be here, Nabil.
I always start out the same question. How did you find your way into this wonderful career of sales compensation?
You know, it's funny. Nobody starts out as a kid saying, I want to be in sales compensation. It's kind of a journey to get there. And I think everybody's journey is a little bit different. For me, I started out the finance background in university, came out, started doing some sales operations type jobs, some marketing jobs, some finance jobs. And what I always found was the most interesting parts of those jobs was the people, right? How do we get people to achieve more, to do more? And so as I started to follow or chase that piece of interest, it always ultimately led to, well, let's talk about incentives. Let's talk about sales compensation. And so I started to craft my roles to be more focused on that. And I started to really think about what are the parts that I enjoy. I enjoy the operations. I enjoy the finance side. I enjoy the people side. It's kind of a natural place to land for me. And it's been interesting. You know, every time you do this, it's different. It's fun. This is where I belong. So this is how I got here.
Yeah, I mean, incentives drives everything, right? And maybe the one difference in the world of sales versus kind of the incentives that drive other parts of the organization is it's like you can see it, the data's right there, the results are immediate return on that incentive that you put forward in front of that team.
It is, and it's the engine for companies, right? This
Yeah.
is where all of the money comes in. This is what keeps the lights on for everyone else. And so you're really at the center of that action, and being able to see and pull levers that will drive that, massively important for the organization. And I think that importance is also one of the attractors for me to come into this type of role and be able to see, you know, that impact that we have every day. How do we make things easier? How do we reduce the friction? How do we keep our organizations moving toward those outcomes that we want?
Yeah, the ability to successfully incentivize relies heavily on understanding the business and all of the nuances that are at stake. Because all rivers flow into sales comp. Everything from product strategy to your margin and cost profile to the underlying go-to-market channels. All that information needs to be funneled in. You need to understand it to execute. So it is very rewarding from that perspective in the sense of like everything that you get to be a part of.
There's a big portion of this role. If you're going to be good at designing plans and executing plans, you have to be deep into context and understand all of the motions that are happening. And it's not just, a sheet of metrics. It's not just, do I have all of the relationships with the right people? It's a combination of a number of things. And the way that you consume context, the way that you understand the business is going to be different than a sales leader. It's going to be different than a finance leader. It's going to be different than a business leader because you have a unique perspective on performance. And the way that you solve some of those challenges or that you achieve some of those results is going to be different. And that's where I think embracing that uniqueness is massively important. And to do that, that's where you have to be able to pull that context, understand from your unique perspective so that you can continue to feed back into the organization. And that's exciting. It's very exposed, but it's also very exciting.
Yeah, 100%. The pain and the thanklessness of the role sometimes is made up for by that reward, I think. I'm curious, you've had this, very amazing career working across all these different organizations, some of the largest companies in the world, the Microsofts and redefining, companies from a consumer perspective like Netflix, where, the cultures of these organizations, the contribution that they've made is massive, but yet different, right? And so across these organizations, across your different roles, what have you learned in terms of, how those cultures and organizations being very different bring to you as a sales comp leader?
Spending time at Microsoft, spending time at Amazon, spending time at Netflix, all very unique and different cultural approaches, not just to their businesses, but to sales incentives and sales compensation. One of the things that you learn is that not every solution works in every place. And so if you think you're going to come in and build from a playbook, there's a limit to what that can achieve. There's a limit to how effective that can be. And so you have to be able to craft and to build a program that will allow for the innate culture within an organization to come through and be meaningful. A big operation may be successful in some places, and an incredibly lean, low-touch operation may be more important somewhere else. How you design the complexity at which you land is going to be different in how you think about problems. And so even if you've seen something before, the playing field may be different. So the ability to adapt and to change and to deliver results across those different cultures, across those different landscapes becomes super important. And again, I'll go back to it's that observation. It's that, context that you're understanding. The more of that that you can process, the more of that that you can deploy, the better your program will be. And it's hard. There's a lot of inputs and a lot of it's noise. But being able to determine what the signals are and to build from that is really the secret sauce for professionals in sales incentives.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, what are the biggest variances that you've seen in terms of, culturally how the sales organization or the reps see the team, the sales comp team, and how they interact with them?
For me, it's very important to build listening mechanisms at all levels in the organization. And so this is part of that contextual argument. It's one thing to be able to take the leadership direction and understand where you're headed. It's another thing to think through, well, how does this actually land with managers that are putting this message in front of their reps? That's a
Yeah.
different perspective. And even for the reps who have to live it, what are they experiencing when they go through this? Now, the top of the organization is always going to have the heaviest vote, but understanding what that perspective is throughout the organization is super critical. And or to be able to re-articulate what's happening on the ground floor sharpens my arguments about what we should or shouldn't deliver, helps to give a different perspective. And that's where, my role, part of it is to be able to be that voice or to be able to articulate that to our leadership so that we can make better judgments. In some cases, you may have an organization that's very in tune with feedback or with those understanding those perspectives. And in other places, it may not matter as much. It just depends on what that culture looks like. But for me, it's really about I need to tap into that because ultimately, what I hear expressed at different levels of the sales organization is going to be a reflection of the motivation that I'm driving. And if that motivation isn't in line with my expected outcome, achieving those hard results, those revenue results, is going to be more or less
When
difficult.
you jump from one company culture to another company culture, I mean, even the way that incentives are structured could be so drastic that some organizations kind of live and thrive off of a constantly changing, very dynamic incentive structure, and that's kind of how the sales organization has been like brought up to adapt. And others, it's kind of this, just the side part, the strategy set over here, and then you have this kind of big bucket number. The incentives themselves don't really change; they're very consistent, and the sales team sees the book of business or what you're going after, kind of more the territory is the dynamic part, perhaps. From going from one company to another, what you end up facing is a very different type of responsibility, and maybe the first aspect I mentioned is heavy on the sales comp team because a lot of the burden explaining and kind of the change sits there versus with the latter, it's maybe more execution. I don't know if you've seen anything that drastic or
Yeah. Well, and I'll give an example, at my days, and this is well in the past at this point, but my days at Microsoft, the sales incentives function there was supporting a number of different business units, lots of different plans, and really ran as kind of an operation in support of the business. And so a lot of the focus was on how do we actually make the rep experience, the manager experience very easy, seamless, reduce errors and issues and friction, and that's important everywhere. But it was certainly very important there. When we think about my role at Netflix now, we're early days of an ads business, and so as we build out that function, everything is changing, not just infrastructure, but what we're offering, how we go to market. All of that is very dynamic, and so the rate of change has to be a little bit faster, or the way that we consume things. And I think that shows up in a couple of ways. One, it's super important, not just because you're reacting to let's build a new plan or a new structure all the time, but you're also thinking about if we're going to be doing that, how do we actually simplify what our plans are, and then focus on just those core things. Because if you're churning a lot and your plan is excessively complex, you really can't operationalize something like that. And so we had to make a choice of no, we're going to be and maintain simplicity as a core principle because we know that the first few years of this go to market for advertising is going to be very change heavy, very hectic, and have a lot of churn. And so to support that, we have to choose to be much more simple. And so we think about things like spiffs or MBOs or some of those complexities that can come in. And we push those to the side, focusing on just core revenue. That's a big part of that strategy. But to be able to articulate that clearly, because every lever that can be pulled will be pulled if you allow it. You just have to get that alignment across your leadership team to be able to say what's most important, and how does it affect us if we start to blend these two things together. That may be too much for us to consume. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into that. And you're right, different companies are at different stages and have different needs. But where we're at today at Netflix, it's very dynamic.
Yeah, to your point, even within a single company, if it's big enough, you might have totally different business units
That's
and
right.
go-to-market functions that look very feel very different. To double click on that, I think when you think about supporting the sales team, I'm curious to get your take on how you interact with the sellers. Is it the sales comp team's job to jump in and educate and kind of performance manage the seller? So think about kind of like an office hours where you're actually, helping a rep understand their book of business and how they optimize their plan and like their sales for an outcome. Or is that the direct sales leader? Or is it a gray line and a gray area that can be supported by both?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would say this has varied in my career, and I've learned a lot over the years with this. I generally use support for managers and reps as that listening mechanism. That's my primary objective. Yes, we do want to answer questions and get people moving and solve issues. That's super important, and the reps and managers love that. They engage. It's a really healthy relationship. But at the end of the day, a sales incentives team is not going to scale to be able to do that across a large organization. And so you do have to rely on your managers and leaders. And so one of the things that I've been wrestling with is how do we actually enable that body so that there's more ownership of the plan? When managers and leaders take ownership of this is the plan we've designed, I understand it, I can support you, that actually has a motivational effect as well versus this is the plan that we have been given. Let's make the most of it. And that subtlety, that subtle difference, can really have a big effect on motivation. So I generally, my team still does the enablement. We go out and launch the plans and spend the time, but we generally treat that as a listening mechanism more so than an education mechanism. And then we rely often on our managers and leaders to deliver the support or that front line or that ownership of what we're trying to achieve. And I found that's better, but it's
Yep.
evolving. That line, to your point, is very gray. And so we have to recalibrate that quite often.
Yeah. It's important for the sales comp team to get the feedback and understand where the friction points are, where the lack of, understanding of the plan is, and, use that to support enablement. But the scalability of it should be
Yeah.
the frontline manager. And your point on bringing them into the plan design process and having ownership does go a far
Mhm.
way because when they're announcing a plan, when you're rolling out that plan, if it's decoupled or feels decoupled from the strategy, even if it's not true, right? It's obviously connected. If it's just a perception, it's harder to kind of make that connection. Whereas I think the best comp plan rollouts that I've seen is, you know, the North Star, the prioritization of the sales team is made clear. And then the translation of, each of those lines is translated to what's in the comp plan. And I think that becomes a, very um, easy way to then enable it because every time there's a meeting done by the sales leader, they kind of reiterate
It's
that message.
it's a great point, and often when we do our enablement or our rollouts, we'll focus on plan mechanics or quotas or what does this mean for me. But you're right, there is a space there where the leader comes in and we'll invite them to open it up, start that conversation, and it's really about okay, this is our go-to-market strategy. Here is how we're making that come to life within your sales comp plan. Let's translate that into something real. And then receptiveness to the plan mechanics is much better. It ties in people can ask questions of both the sales leader,
Yeah.
the sales incentives team, and it's really more of a cohesive approach and lands far better.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the presence of the sales comp team to listen when people do ask questions or when they reach out is difficult to scale it and know all the nuances of every single territory that the sales manager should know. But that openness to have that feedback loop is very powerful because I imagine if your sales comp team hears something, then it might be a feedback mechanism into changing the visualizations, changing the cadence of reporting, addressing, unknowns, which without that listening is very, difficult to understand the perception
Well,
on the ground floor.
And it's easy in a lot of organizations to say, okay, well, what are our signals that we're getting from sales incentives? Well, let's look at, performance or quota attainment, or let's look at performance distributions. I think the data side of it is one part and super, super critical, but there is a softer side as well. And balancing those two things is really powerful. That's where, the story that supports the data or the anecdote that follows up, that makes things come to life for a lot of people. And so the more that you can balance or find that middle ground allows you to be more impactful when you need to make hard judgment calls or you need to do something that requires your leadership team to trust your judgment. Those are things that are important.
Yeah, 100%. You mentioned something earlier. I'm going to double click on, which is, plan customization versus simplicity and how you think about that.
It's funny, and I think as organizations mature, that's certainly that calculus changes a little bit as well. But for me, we have kind of a North Star of, well, we do want really customized or really individualized plans. So how do we achieve that? That doesn't mean that we need to go back and account for every dollar of revenue in a certain way or give it special treatment. But what it does mean is we want the goals to be super meaningful. Now that means let's try and individualize your quotas. Let's try and give you something that's valuable. But the mechanics of the plan don't need to be super complex. We're willing to take a risk on, we don't have to worry about all of the inputs that you have, whether it's meeting volume, it's, pipeline health, things like that. Those are going to show up in that final revenue number. Can we trust that we'll get there? Well, yes. But that also means we need our sales ops partners or revenue ops partners to ensure that we're monitoring or managing or teaching our sales reps how to operate such that they can achieve those results. We don't need to put those things into the plan itself. And so it's really about where do we get the most focus and drive on the plan? And that's with simple structures that are meaningful versus complexities or trying to solve for everything. But one of the challenges that we have as sales incentives professionals is, people reach for sales incentives because it works, right? You can see the effect when you change a plan. That doesn't mean everything should be, managed through a sales incentives program. It just means that you will get behaviors when you push on that. Now, for me, focusing on revenue, focusing on simple core metrics is much more impactful versus starting there and then every complexity, stepping back and distracting from that core goal. It's a balance, and sometimes you need to solve things in a short term to build a muscle. But the more you can be simple, the better off I feel you'll be.
Yeah, yeah. There's always a risk of
That's
diluting
that's
the
right.
the plan, and I mean it works, but yeah, like any incentive structure anywhere, the more diluted it is, the less powerful. I mean, I think the notion of individualized incentives is interesting because humans are different and motivation is different. What matters to one person, the way they think, the way they operate is very nuanced. There's an interesting element of, customized targets or individualized targets. To me, it's kind of like a table stakes. I mean, like, how do you measure good if you're not actually giving everyone a fair shot at achieving the number that you give? And so, unless you have kind of an efficient way to route business opportunity such that everyone can have a similar target, and then it's the routing, then individualized targets, are almost kind of table stakes. But individualized incentives is where you kind of run into think about this future state world where, every day, depending on who you are as a seller and where you are in your cycle and life cycle with all your opportunities, you actually have a different incentive structure truly. You can imagine a future world where, where that's done and it could be very powerful. I'm curious to get your perspective on how you solve for the perception of equity. And
Mhm.
now equity becomes a trust in this black box algorithm. You could see a world where in 20, 30 years, like this just becomes the de facto standard. Like as AI continues to advance, it just seems like it could go down that path. Yeah, I'm curious to get your perspective on how do you solve the equity side of it?
Yeah, one of the things that's I have found to be incredibly helpful is really understanding not just each role, each sales role independently, but understanding it as an ecosystem. And what often happens is when you have many different individual plans, setting aside targets, but plans, the way that they work or that conflict or the crossover becomes much more complex. And even if you put, push on one one brick, another one will fall out. And so it's hard to be able to manage that. Now, if you have kind of a coherent go-to-market strategy where these roles are playing together, they're aligned, we have a full motion working in one direction, it's much easier to say, okay, now let's just carve up the pieces of that and understand where we need a different structure or not. I spend a lot more time thinking about and worrying about how do we individualize the responsibility across the revenue number than I do about let's build multiple different structures within the plans because this specialist or this account manager or this customer success manager is very different. No, we're all kind of working toward that goal. We each have our own different parts. The structure in which we pay them, that can be simplified. And the variables will change. The pay mix is a little bit different, or how we accelerate, but the core structure of the plan, if that's coherent and equitable, then you get into a scenario where you're just, everyone understands this is how we pay as a philosophy, and that has power, that has some equity components to it. And then it's about, okay, now you may not be direct selling, so you're going to be a little bit less leveraged. Those are the kinds of conversations that I think are easier to have. It's really when you start to have different structures across those roles where now you really are trying to figure out which crosses where, who's in conflict, how do we solve some of these things. You spend more time untangling that mess than actually trying to motivate and drive your sales team. One of the things I'm thankful for at Netflix is because we are starting fairly new. We don't have to build lots of things, or we haven't had lots of mergers and acquisitions where we're adopting
Different
multiple
cultures.
versions of those, and so it's an easier place to start from. But it's super critical, and really it just depends on what do you want your sales incentives function to be focused on and doing, untangling and managing that, or really focusing the team so that they can drive harder and harder revenue goals.
You bring up something that I do want to double click on because it's what you want your sales comp team to focus on.
Yeah.
Like the scope is can vary significantly from one organization to the other, right? Whether quota setting is owned within sales comp or not. Sometimes sales comp and ops and sales ops sit in totally different departments and function and operate very differently because they're different cultures depending on where they sit in that company. How have you seen, the scope of what is within sales comp, where it sits, and the stakeholder management all come together? And I know it's a big question, but I think maybe starting with at least what's in scope and then diving into the the stakeholder management side would be interesting.
Yeah, I think when you're in a sales incentives function, no matter what, where you sit, you're going to have to be heavily engaged with your talent and HR partners. You're going to have to be very engaged on the finance side, and you're going to have to be very engaged on the sales ops, rev ops, and sales functions. You cannot do this without touching all of those pieces. Now, the reality is, a lot of the go-to-market where the seams are between the teams, I've seen lots of balancing between sales ops and sales incentives. Often that's right along the quota setting line where sales ops would set quotas, sales incentives would ultimately manage the payouts and the administration of the plan. All of that means that you can't do one of those without the other. And so the more aligned you are, especially with that rev ops and sales ops organization, the more valuable your solutions can be. Now, you've also got to make sure you can pay for it all. And so the finance becomes super important. And as it controls and as a health of your program, evaluation, audits, there are lots of things that cross over there. And really, if you want to get down to the core of a sales incentives function, what you're really talking about is not just the revenue result. That's definitely a big part of it. But the other big part of it is attraction and retention of talent. And so how do you design a plan that not just motivates the people in seat, but allows you to go to market and get the talent that's, in line with your strategy? Are these the best people that we can get to drive our revenue results? That's super critical too. And so aligning with that comp philosophy, aligning with that talent strategy is also important. So there's a big ecosystem there, and lots of companies do it many different ways. And so there's not really a right or wrong way. There's a way that fits with your culture and with your company. In terms of stakeholder management, this is where it's super important. To balance, I think, transparency within a sales incentives function and privacy, frankly. A lot of the data and the things that we're looking at
Yeah.
are very confidential, very, very private, things that we need to secure. But the design, the structures, those things can't just be a black box. We have to make sure that if we're designing a plan, can we actually set quotas at that level? Can we actually operationalize the payout. Does this make sense in market? Can we afford the plan that we're doing? What, I always think about, how much does it cost for sales incentives as a function of our revenue? Do we peg it to a number that we're all comfortable with and we can run within that as a budget? All of those considerations are super critical. And so when I was talking about that, gathering context and understanding the business, you also have to push context out. And so it's not just consume. This is also about how do we make sure that our finance partners, that our talent partners, that our sales
Yeah.
ops partners really have a good feel and are along for the journey, so that it's not just we get to the end and we launch this thing and everyone says, wait, now I can't do this, I can't do that. You have to bring them along, and they'll often, that relationship often is very reciprocal in terms of what you're hearing and seeing in the context you can consume, which in turn makes it a better product when you're delivering. All of that to say, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of
Yeah.
relationships. You spend a lot of time in one-on-ones and listening, but I think that pays off. And so the way that you can structure that to achieve that partnership and that context is super critical. And so I find these roles to be very relational as well. And for people to come in, even if you think, hey, I want to, process, or I'm an operator, I want to do these things. Sure, that's part of it, but you have to be relational as well in order to be really, really successful at the top end in these roles.
100%. Yeah. I mean, you want to get alignment of the underlying complexity, the design decisions that you make as a sales comp team to the rest of the departments that have a lot of impact on the success of sales comp, right? Like if
That's right.
HR decides to shift role definitions in a certain way, the way they, use and communicate sales comp for recruiting, all the way to, finance's decision to recognize comp expense a certain way or not. I mean, all of this can have such a massive impact, let alone what sales is doing. And so I think every
Right.
stakeholder needs to be brought on the journey. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's like, when do you want to pay the price? Do you want to pay the
Right.
price when decisions get made that impact you very negatively? And ultimately impact the business very negatively, or do you want to just be proactive and do it? I'm
That's right.
curious what avenue you use. I think the organizations that I've seen that seem to do it very well have a very strong like documentation or writing
Mhm.
culture where they're disseminating this information in a very kind of like structured cadence. It's very difficult to do, right? You have to take a lot of time set aside. Team needs to be fully bought in, but curious what avenues and kind of mediums that you've seen work best for that.
Yeah, it's interesting to talk about that doc writing
Yeah.
culture. Certainly, at my time at Amazon, Amazon is famously a doc
Yeah.
writing culture and very specific and rigid about that. Netflix is as well, minus some of the rigidity. So there's less focus on the form and format and more focus on, no, we need to have a place to write and put ideas down, but we also want to move fast, and so it doesn't have to be the same level of perfection. I have found that to be super helpful in a couple of areas. One, certainly when you're making high velocity decisions, to be able to go back and understand, okay, we may decided on 10 things this week, but I forgot number four. Now we can go back and understand and work through that. I have found that it's incredibly helpful for onboarding, having that persistence or that trail of how were decisions made and what's happened is incredibly helpful for shortcutting onboarding for employees as well. But there is something to be said about when you have to put those thoughts down on paper. You think about it differently. I can sit in a meeting and riff, and it's, we can go back and forth. But if I have to think about it and publish something, it's a different level of thought. I will have my initial reactions, and I'll put that down, but it will get refined and it will get iterated on, and that's super helpful. Especially when you have non-obvious ideas or things that you're trying to land, or when you're trying to get to that complexity, or the complexity of idea. I think about the perspective of trying to integrate across teams as well. Because we sit in the center of a number of organizations, it's helpful to use that as a collaboration spot where, okay, now we can ship this. This is our unformed idea. How does sales ops react to this? How does talent react to this? How do our finance partners react to this? Let's continue to craft this together. And that's been super helpful for me. It's added more rigor to what I'm trying to do, and that has generally produced a better result.
And it goes a long way if you do it right. You put the structure in. It also sends a message to your team, right? This is how we operate.
Yeah.
This is the level of the caliber and the kind of org we're going to run to connect all
Yeah.
these other stakeholders. This type of management and relationship building and kind of communication transparency just is good best practice. But it's an important piece to get out to the sales companies. So I appreciate you sharing that and us diving in. So just to dive into our fun segment, we'd love to get your perspective on the non-obvious or the hot take within the world of sales comp or RevOps.
one of the things that I've had to rewire myself on here in the last few years, so joining Netflix, they have a different approach than companies I've worked with in the past. And that approach is to be data informed rather than data driven. That probably grates on people a little bit or sounds strange, but the idea is centered around speed. At some companies, you'll have problem solving that goes down to how do we be as precise as possible so that we can make the right decision. Getting the decision right is most important. Netflix is a smaller company. We don't have tens and tens of thousands of employees. It's very much built on relationships and built on speed. And so what we optimize for is that pace. How fast can we be? And to do that, there's a point of, at least in Netflix's writing, there's a point of diminishing returns on, the precision at which you solve things. And so we try and hire people that have really good judgment and make good decisions with limited information. It's easy to make good decisions if you have all of the information, but it's slow. And so this is really about finding that balance between how do I know when I have enough data to be confident that my judgment will be right, and make that decision and act. And it's changed my mindset quite a bit, because it's also comfortable to wait for, go get me one more report, show me the data. I need these numbers. That's a comfortable place to sit in. It's much more difficult to say, hey, we have this non-obvious answer. We have a little bit of data. Are we comfortable making a decision and moving? And we would choose to say, no, fast is better. Let's make the decision. If it's wrong, we'll walk it back. But acting is more important than being fully precise. And as long as we keep hiring great people that can lean into that judgment space, that's where speed comes up. Now, in a sales incentives function, that becomes super critical because, now not only are you the expert or the governor of this program, you're sharing that expertise with a lot of people who are trusting you. And so that trust gets tested every time you have to make one of those judgments. And that's a very lonely island sometimes,
Yeah.
but it's getting into that mindset of, what does my experience tell me? How do I think about these things such that with being data informed, I can make those judgments. I don't have to wait so that everything is fully data driven, and that's hard for a lot of people to wrap their head around. But it's something I have come to value quite a bit.
There's a ton of studies, but there's one in specific that I remember about that they did with Fortune 500s, and it was the most successful companies are the ones that reacted to fix mistakes the fastest, not necessarily the ones that made the fewest mistakes. And I mean, this is
Right.
not, it's a somewhat obvious. It's like, yeah, you're never going to be perfect in your decision making. So how fast can you course correct? I mean, it's
That's right.
funny because you're talking about Netflix, but it also kind of connects to the one-way door versus two-way door approach at Amazon, right? And I think
That's right.
you combine both and you get to this position where, you can truly, move with speed and, occasionally make a mistake, but that's fine as long as you kind of course correct quickly enough and can do so.
Yeah, and that one-way door versus two-way doors is massively important too, because being able to articulate or to categorize what types of decisions you have allows you to choose the right tool to solve it, and that enables speed as well. But there, every company is different. We all have different
Yeah.
approaches. But yeah, generally, I have learned to opt for speed and speed of correction, to your point.
So as we wrap up here, I always ask two questions. And in the industry, who would you most like to take out to lunch and why?
I love spending time with sales comp operators, the people that are really dealing with it. They often hear and see the worst of the complaints. This is wrong. How do you fix this? Here's my issues. And so they often have a very
Yeah.
real perspective. And one of the things I like to do is to spend a lot of time having lunch with operators and different people at that level. But in the industry, there's a guy, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with Simon Sinek. And he's really more of a leadership and a motivator. So he works at the Optimism company, but he's written a number of books. But one of the things that I find most fascinating about him is he's really talking about motivation of teams and of people that you manage and lead and leadership in a very interesting and way. And I would love to have lunch and bridge some of that leadership thoughts with a deep dive on, okay, well, let's talk about sales incentives, where this is another type of motivation. How do you think about some of these topics? How do you dig in? That would be fascinating for me to spend that time. And just like his company name, he's also very much an optimist. I'm an optimist myself, and I always think, like, in sales incentives, that's kind of a key trait as well. To be kind of that cheerleader, that push, or helping the sales organization rally around goals. That's a big piece of it. And so as we think about motivation, I would love to get kind of that optimistic take from Simon and spend some time over lunch.
Yeah, I love that. I think it is kind of a hidden trait that you need to have because in the world of sales comp, there's no shortage of challenges and the timelines are tight. So you need to be able to kind of rally a team around that and get everyone excited and for the sake of like recognizing that, most times people underestimate what they can accomplish. And I think
That's
that
true.
optimistic side really kind of helps carry you through those moments. So
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Optimism often helps people meet or rise to those expectations or the things that they didn't believe they could do. And it's a big part of it. And when we think about motivation through the plan, there's also motivation of the function. There's motivation of the people that are running the plan. And it's all the same science.
yeah, 100%. 100%. And so to wrap up on my final question here, what's a book or resource or podcast you recommend to share with the audience and the community?
Yeah, I'll actually go back to an older book that helped me out earlier in my career. It's called Go Put Your Strengths to Work. And this is by Marcus Buckingham. But the idea, and he built a kind of a program around this about how do you understand what your strengths are? And not strengths in terms of, hey, I'm really good at solving these problems, but strengths in terms of these are the things that I get energy from doing. And these are the things, weaknesses that drain me at the time. And what part of his philosophy is that if you do more of the things that give you energy, your ability to be successful is massively increased. If you're always trying to solve or overcome things that are weaknesses, things that drain you, you're not going to make very much progress. And so his whole approach is how do you identify those things and then how do you lean into them into your organization? And for me as a leader, building out a sales incentive function, it's really about how do you build complementary pieces? How do you find people that really want to lean in and do, the operator role? Who wants to do and gets energy and strength from, designing plans? Crafting that team as a leader is super fascinating to me, and I think has allowed me to have some level of success over the years by building those things. But that was something that was introduced to me early in my career. Go Put Your Strengths to Work by Marcus Buckingham, and very valuable. And I go back to it even now, years later, when I need a refresher.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think there are certain times of the day where I'm going to be better at doing certain types of tasks, and if you can kind of figure that mapping of energy and what you can do, and you time your schedule accordingly, I know it's done wonders for the ability for me to kind of have a very a productive day beginning to end. That's a very interesting book and great recommendation for everyone, and to kind of really take it to optimize the work that you do every day because there's a lot of there's high expectations and there's no shortage of work. So yeah, that's
It's big. These jobs are hard. These jobs are complex. Yeah, give ourselves as much opportunity to be successful as we can.
100%. Well, Nathan, this episode has been very insightful and I really thank you for doing everything you do to share with the community and promote this entire space of incentive design, incentive comp operations, and yeah, thank you again for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Nabil.
The Sales Compensation Show is brought to you by Forma AI, the sales performance management platform that fully integrates sales planning with rapid, scalable incentive compensation management. Our data platform brings together how you can plan and manage the entire lifecycle of territories, quotas, and incentives. With global customers like Autodesk, Stryker, and Hootsuite, we enable go-to-market teams to plan and deploy even the most complex SPM strategies at speed, taking you from idea to execution instantly. To learn more about Forma AI, visit our website at forma.ai. Hit the subscribe button and find more episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.